Hey everybody, tonight's video is called Deliverance from the Furnace, and tonight we continue our pass-through study in the book of Daniel. We're going to be looking at Daniel and what I like to call, with the other Hebrew boys, the gang, with the fiery furnace. So, this is a very common chapter that people know out of the book of Daniel. Right behind Daniel chapter 6 with Daniel and the lion. And so we're going to be in chapter 3 today, and I can't promise that this is going to be a short video, so bear with me as we go through Daniel chapter 3. There's so much to it. And so Daniel chapter 3 verse 1 opens, Nebuchadnezzar the king made an image of gold whose height was 6 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So we see this statue, which the king made arrogantly, represented himself as an expression of his greatness and glory, and reflected the dream where he was the head of gold, as seen in Daniel 2, chapter 2, verse 38. And the word for image usually means in human form. And the height of the figure was about 90 feet with 9 feet. It would have been comparable in height to date palms found in that area. And this established the worship of Nebuchadnezzar and the nation under his power, in addition to the other gods. And 8 times in this chapter alone, we are told that this is the image that Nebuchadnezzar set up, making it clear that it's merely an idol made by man, not a god with transcendent powers. And the plain of Dura was probably about 6 miles south of Babylon at this time. In verse 2 and 3 it says, And King Nebuchadnezzar sent word to gather together the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the administrators, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered together for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So we see leaders basically attending this summit conference for Nebuchadnezzar's display. And they are satraps, or leaders over regions, and administrators of military chiefs. There's governors, civil administrators, counselors, there's lawyers, treasurers, judges, or government arbitrators. There's magistrates and judges, in the sense are today officials and other civil leaders. And a satrap is a person-load word that means protector of the realm. And the demand that all come to the dedication ceremony means that King Nebuchadnezzar meant to use the worship of this image as a test of allegiance to himself. So in a way, he's pretty much like a dictator. In verse 4 and 5 it says, Then a herald cried aloud, To you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at the time you hear the sound of the horn, flute, harp, lyre, and psaltery, and sympathy, with all kinds of music, you shall fall down and worship the gold image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So like a harp, possibly square or rectangular, with strings to pluck with the plectrum, the pick, yielding high tones. Psaltery is an instrument plucked with the fingers rather than a plectrum, a pick. Yielding high tones. Psaltery is an instrument plucked with the fingers rather than the pick, yielding low tones. And so verse 6 it says, And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast immediately into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. So we see the threat is made. And some ancient kilns were found to have been shaped like a vertical tunnel open only at the top with the dome supported by columns. And charcoal normally served as fuel, and they were used by the Babylonians for fire and bricks, as seen back in Genesis 11:3. Execution by burning also wasn't unknown, as seen also in Jeremiah 29 verse 22. And the command to worship the image was backed up by a very powerful threat to be treated with treason if they refused to worship this image. And not only as a religious offense, it would be an offense against the king. And Nebuchadnezzar was just like many politicians who often use religion to strengthen their grip of political power. And they combined spiritual allegiance with national allegiance. And here, Baldur von Schirach, who was the head of a youth program for Nazi Germany, said, "If we act as true Germans, we act according to the laws of God." And whoever serves Adolf Hitler serves Germany. And whoever serves Germany serves God. That is what this guy, the head of the youth program for Nazi Germany, had said. And so often today we see it happening even in America in our politics. Whenever somebody's running for office, they always put on I'm going to quote Bible verses, and I'm going to make people think that I'm actually among the Christians. In 1960, President of Ghana had a life-size statue of himself erected in front of the National House of the Parliament. And on this statue of this president of Ghana, on the side of the statue read, "Seek ye first the political kingdom, and all other things shall be added unto you." Isn't it crazy? That guy took a verse out of Matthew chapter 6, I believe it's verse 33, what Jesus said. When Jesus said, "First seek the kingdom, and then these things will be added unto you." This guy took that verse and made it about himself. A bloodless coup destroyed that statue in 1966. And then in the United States, we have a president who created their own God Bless America Bible. And he signed it, he's endorsed it, and he's got other spiritual leaders around him that are endorsing this thing. You know, and has his image and all that type of stuff. And so just about every politician in the United States, almost all of them, not all, almost all of them will put religion in their campaigns. So to continue on here, in verse 7, it says, "So at that time when all the people heard the sound of the horn, flute, harp, and lyre, in sympathy with all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshipped the gold image which King Nebuchadnezzar had set up." So it seems as if Nebuchadnezzar's idol has successfully revoked the curse on the Tower of Babel. And Nebuchadnezzar's grand idolatry was accompanied by music. Elaborate and well-produced music brings power both for good and for evil. And there was a total and immediate obedience to this king's command. Verse 8 through 10. "Therefore at that certain time, certain Chaldeans came forward and accused the Jews. They spoke and said to King Nebuchadnezzar, 'O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and psaltery, in sympathy with all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the gold image.'" So certain Chaldeans were most likely the priests of Bel-Merodach, who were envious of these young Jews, and they sought their death. In verse 11 and 12, "And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not paid due regard to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the gold image which you have set up. So enemies of God's servants witnessed such a clear-cut testimony that they were in no doubt about the rejection of idolatry and unshakable allegiance to the God of Israel. And they were prejudiced against the Jews as they were jealous of the privileged position held by Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And they charged them with rebellion and ingratitude toward the king. And Daniel is presumably not present in this occasion. In verse 13, then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and fury, gave the command to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So they brought these men before the king. So once again, we see Daniel's not mentioned as being part of the refusal to worship witnessed by the Chaldeans. And if present, he would have surely joined the other three in their faithfulness to God. In verse 14 and 15 says, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the gold image which I have set up? Now if you are ready at the time you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the harp, the lyre, and psaltery, in sympathy with all kinds of music, and you fall down and worship the image that I have made, good. But if you do not worship, you shall be cast immediately into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God who would deliver you from my hands? So to give Nebuchadnezzar credit here, and I don't always side with dictators, or he didn't accept the accusation based on the hearsay. He gave opportunity for a physical encounter or interview of the accused. And the king's challenge would return to embarrass him. And the true God was able to deliver. And just as he was able to reveal a dream and its meaning to this king, Nebuchadnezzar had earlier called him the capital G, God of gods, in just the prior chapter. But having let that fade from his attention, he soon would be shocked and humiliated when God took up his challenge, as we're going to see coming up in verses 28-29. And Nebuchadnezzar was also seen challenging the power of the God of Israel in 2 Kings 18, verse 33-35. And so King Nebuchadnezzar would put pressure on these Hebrew boys to compromise. Yet God was more than real to them than any of those things. And Nebuchadnezzar really believed that God was in himself, not the God, capital G, God of Israel, or the gods of Babylon. In verse 16-18 says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If that is the case, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king. But if not, let it be known to you, O king, that we do not serve your gods, nor will we worship the gold image which you have set up. So I love the boldness and the courage of them. And so one thing we should understand here is that they did not mean disrespect to the king. They didn't have any defense, nor did they need to reconsider their commitment, since they stood fast for their God as being the only true and living God. And their lives were in his hands, as indicated here in verse 17 and 18. And that's the central theme of this chapter, that the idea isn't that God will always protect his people from physical harm, as in Isaiah 43 verse 1 and 2. He may do that, and certainly God is able to protect us from any harm. But the central idea is that God's people should be obedient to him regardless of the consequences. And it doesn't matter if we have to be martyred. We need to obey God rather than man. And we often complain about our rights and what is fair. And often it's better to make a stand and endure our difficulty, leaving our fate in God's hands. And they didn't doubt God's abilities, or did they presume to know God's will. They recognized that God's plan might be different than their desires, but regardless, they were going to stand for the Lord rather than this man. And we all have our dreams and desires. We pray that God fulfills them. But if he doesn't, we cannot turn our back on him. And that needs to be our mindset. And for me, when I think of my son passing into eternity at the age of 10, if this was like 10 years, before that day, I probably would have walked away and turned my back on God. Now, my flesh may have felt 1,000 millions of emotions and thoughts when that whole experience. But I had to come to terms on the sovereignty of God in life trauma. And it took great faith for these Hebrew boys to say no to this powerful dictator type king. And they were prepared for this through the test to eat impure foods. And obedience in the small things are important no matter what. All obedience starts small. And no matter the cost of following Christ, we must be like the Hebrew boys in Job, who said in Job 13:15, though he slay me, yet I will trust him. In verse 19 through 21 says, the Nebuchadnezzar was full of fury, and the expression on his face changed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He spoke and commanded that they heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he commanded certain mighty men of valor who were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their trousers, their turbans, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. So we see the king's fury at being defied to his face led him to cry for an intensification of heat. And 7 times, speaking of a gauge, or it's not speaking of a gauge, it's not saying, turn it up from 70 degrees to 490 degrees, or 7 times the amount of fuel. He uses figuratively 7 to denote completeness, as used in Leviticus 26, verse 18 through 28, Proverbs chapter 6, verse 31, and Proverbs 24, verse 16. They similarly use 10. They similarly to 10 used in Daniel 1:20. And a stone or brick furnace with an air draft could be made hotter by more fuel and air. And everything was done to make sure that these 3 Hebrew boys were going to be quickly and completely annihilated. In verse 22, therefore, because the king's command was urgent and the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So this fire was so hot that the guys who threw the boys in there were consumed. And took up refers to being taken upward on some kind of ramp to a spot near enough to the top to be thrown in. And the fire was so hot that it incinerated the king's men. In verse 23, and these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. So a shaft directed them into the furnace bottom on top of the fuel. Verse 24-25, King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose in haste and spoke, saying to his counselors, Did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said to the king, True, O king. Verse 25, he said, Look, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the form of the 4th is like the capital Son of God. So it is astonishing that anyone survived for a moment, even inside this furnace, when others perished at the door. In the Greek Old Testament says, Daniel 3:24, that Nebuchadnezzar's attention was caught when he heard the men singing praises in the furnace. And if there was singing in the furnace, if that is true, it reminds me of Paul and Silas singing in the prison, the Philippian jail, in the book of Acts. And the king seemed only to have known that a 4th person was a heavenly being. And he called them a son of the gods, which was a pagan reference to one who appeared supernatural and as an angel. And some theologians, and also myself, we hold to the stance that the 4th person that King Nebuchadnezzar witnesses in this furnace is the pre-incarnate Christ. And Daniel doesn't clarify if the 3 Hebrew boys were aware that the Son of God was with them in this furnace. But God can deliver us from our trials, or he can miraculously sustain and strengthen us in a trial. In verse 26-27 says, Then Nebuchadnezzar went near the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spoke, saying, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came from the midst of the fire. And the satraps, administrators, governors, and the king's counselors gathered together, and they saw these men on whose bodies the fire had no power. The hair of their head was not singled, nor were the garments affected, and the smell of fire was not on them. And that's a miracle in itself, for them to be in the fiery furnace without having a smoke of burning or anything on them. And Siri's lost on my Apple Watch. She doesn't understand any of this. But the Most High God is a title expressing God's universal authority. And Nebuchadnezzar isn't professing faith in the God of Israel. He still speaks of the Lord as their God, not his. So don't miss that. Just because he witnessed this miracle where the pre-incarnate Christ is in the furnace with the boys that he had ordered to death, seeing the presence of God didn't convert him. He still speaks as their God. And to a Jew, there is only one God. And when God enacts a miracle, he supernaturally controls all details so that his power is unmistakable and there's no other explanation. And their trial had no power over them because they thoroughly submitted to the power and the will of God. In verse 28 through 30, to finish the chapter, right before that, I want to point out that not even their hairs on their head were burned. And I don't know about you, but if you ever smell hair burning, it's gross. It's a disgusting smell. And so there was no disgusting smell coming off the boys. But verse 28 through 30 says, Nebuchadnezzar spoke, saying, Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and they have frustrated the king's word, and yielded their bodies so that they should not serve, nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I will make a decree that any people, nation, or language which speaks anything amiss of the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap, because there is no other God who can deliver like this. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. And I'm going to just take a sip here real quick. We still got a little ways to go here. So verse 28 through 30. The king, convinced and eager to add the God of those men to his collection of deities. And soon he learned that God was not one of many, but he was the only God in the next chapter. And in Isaiah 43, verse 1 and 2, God promises presence when Israel walked through the fire. And this popular story of the fiery furnace shows himself faithful to that promise. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they surrendered themselves completely to God, body, soul, and spirit. They did not ask King Nebuchadnezzar to make his decree, but him seeing God at work in his life and the life of his people was an extremely effective testimony to Nebuchadnezzar. And so, to wrap up our study for today, we look tonight at King Nebuchadnezzar erecting an image and demanded everyone to worship it as it's set up and made. And verse 2 and 3 shows all Babylonia's dignitaries gathered at the dedication of the image. Verse 4 through 6 shows the command to worship the image. Verse 7 shows the crowd obeying Nebuchadnezzar's command. Verse 8 through 12 shows certain Chaldeans accuse the 3 Hebrew men. Verse 13 through 15 shows King Nebuchadnezzar interviewed the disobedient Hebrew boys. And what we should learn through them is to stick to our stand for God, even under trial or persecution, even if it costs you everything. And we must remember that Jesus said, if you want to be my disciples, you need to lay down your own lives. And don't be a Peter denying Jesus when asked if it is true, when he followed Jesus after his arrest. And verse 16 through 18 shows us the 3 Hebrew men insist that they will never worship the image. And I want to go over to 1 John chapter 2, verse 15. 1 John 2:15 says, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So many today claim to love Jesus and they think highly of him, yet they are far from him as they love and worship the world and self and sin. And the Hebrew boys show us that obedience to God in the small things even matter. How they obeyed God in the dietary laws. And now this trial came with the fiery furnace. Verse 19 through 23 shows us the 3 men were cast violently into this furnace. Verse 24-25 shows Nebuchadnezzar sees 4 alive when only 3 were put in there. And remember when I mentioned about the Greek part of the scripture showing them singing? I want to look at Paul and Silas real quick here in the book of Acts chapter 16, verse 25. It says, but at midnight Paul and Silas were praying and singing hymns to God, and the prisoners were listening to him. And it reminds us of Paul. Verse 26-27 shows the Hebrew men leaving the furnace unharmed. And talking about persecution and everything, let's go over to John chapter 16, verse 33. It says here, these things I have spoken to you. This is Jesus speaking. These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. So, in our trials, we must reflect John 16:33, that these words of Jesus, that we will have trouble, but we need to put our faith in God. We need to trust God in all things to find that peace. In verse 28 of Daniel 3 showed Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged the greatness of the God of the three Hebrews. Let's go over to the book of Romans chapter 12. Romans 12 verse 1 and 2. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So may we surrender ourselves completely to the Lord, like the Hebrew boys did. And the chapter, it ends with King Nebuchadnezzar making a proclamation that nothing evil should be said against the God of the Hebrews. Let's go over to 2 Corinthians 3. And we're coming up for a landing here. It's actually better timing than I thought it was going to be. I was expecting probably 45 minutes. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 2 and 3 says, you are our epistle, written in our hearts, known and read by all men. Clearly you are an epistle of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but by the Spirit of the living God. Not on tablets of stone, but on tablets of flesh, that is, of the heart. So the Apostle Paul also spoke about how the work of God in his people's lives is an effective testimony to others. In Nebuchadnezzar, he gave a picture of the future like the Antichrist, who forces the world in the one religion of idolatry. And Revelation 13 is basically an image of Nebuchadnezzar commanding worship. And the fiery furnace is like the great tribulation, which will be a great affliction for the Jews. And the three Hebrew boys are like Israel, who will be preserved through the tribulation. And the executioners who perished are like those in league with the Antichrist, who Jesus will slay at his return. And the mysteriously absent Daniel is like the church, who isn't present at the time of the Great Tribulation. And I also want to make mention that my friend Brian Peckham is doing a study on a book focused on Revelation on Saturdays, usually at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time, Facebook Live. So feel free to check that out if you would like. And so that's going to wrap up today's study. And we'll see you next as we'll be looking at the fall and the rise of King Nebuchadnezzar. And that will be taking place on Saturday, Lord willing. So we are now a quarter of the way through the book of Daniel. And you're like, wow, we're already a quarter of the way there. Because Daniel's only 12 chapters. But I hope that you have a great rest of your evening. And we'll see you this weekend. God bless.